On the Xbox and PC we have an option called Auto HDR, which adds HDR capabilities or HDR functionality to supported games. On the PlayStation 5, on the other hand, we have an option called HDR Always On, which works always and without any additional support. But there's a big difference between PlayStation 5 and Xbox. But before we now start with this video, I have a big favor to ask. Please like, share and subscribe. And now let's talk about the differences between Auto HDR on the Xbox and HDR Always On the PlayStation 5. And we're starting with the PlayStation 5 version, and the first thing what I have done is I analyzed the maximum peak brightness, what the game is trying to output at this very moment. And as you can see, what I found is that the maximum peak brightness right now is 230 nits. And just to make sure that I'm not doing anything wrong, I analyzed different screenshots, different scenarios, and what I found is it was always the same. 230 nits is the maximum peak brightness in non-supported HDR games on the PlayStation 5. And 230 nits is not even close to a proper HDR brightness. So that means right now with the HDR Always On function set to on the PlayStation 5, there is no difference in the game at all. So there is no additional brightness or HDR information. All what is happening is actually you force the TV into an HDR picture format, but the game information stays still the same. But what does this mean now in terms of brightness, what we can actually see with our own eyes? And we need to keep in mind that this depends, of course, on the screen what we're using or the TV what we're using, and also on our picture settings. Because what we learned so far is that the brightness in the content what I measured, what I analyzed, is limited to 230 nits. But this doesn't mean that your TV is just capable of outputting 230 nits. It can be more or less depending again on your screen type, on the TV type and picture settings what you are using. And very important now is on the tone mapping functionality, what are you using on your screen? And when we're talking about tone mapping or different tone mapping options on the LG OLED TVs, we have actually 3 different tone mapping options when you play a game in HDR. First of all, we have HDRG, which is in most of the games my recommendation to use. Then we have dynamic tone mapping on, which is in most of the games not my recommendation at all to use. And then last but not least, we have dynamic tone mapping on, which is in not many games my recommendation to use. So you can see on an OLED TV like the LG CX or the G2, we have a choice to choose on how we like to display our HDR picture on our screen. And there's just one very important thing to remember when you use the HDR Always On functionality on the PlayStation 5 in combination with non-HDR games. You must use dynamic tone mapping on to have actually additional brightness in the game or on your TV, not in the game, because we talked already about this. The game content is still just mastered in SDR. There's nothing changed. There has nothing changed. The only thing what has changed is that we are now forcing the TV in the HDR picture option. And why you should or must use dynamic tone mapping on is very simple to explain. I measured the real brightness on my TV with a colorimeter, and in the HDRG picture mode and on the PlayStation 5 with the HDR Always On functionality turned on, my maximum brightness was around 250 candela maximum brightness. And please keep in mind, this is HDR, a HDR picture format right now, but it's not even close to HDR brightness. With dynamic tone mapping off, it was even a little bit lower, 225 candela or nits. Just with dynamic tone mapping on, I reached a peak brightness on my TV measured with a colorimeter of around 800 candela. And now you can see why you must or should use dynamic tone mapping on the PlayStation 5 in combination with the HDR Always On functionality and non-HDR games. Because again, I explain this again, there is no additional brightness information in the game because it's just not there. It's complete different compared to the Xbox Series, which we are going to talk in a minute. So we need to keep in mind a couple of figures here. Just keep in mind that I measured a maximum peak brightness in the game of around 230 candela, and the maximum output in terms of brightness on my screen in HDHE was around 250 nits. So this is very similar to what I have measured actually or analyzed in the game. So and now we are going to compare this with Auto HDR on the Xbox Series. And of course the first thing what I have done is I analyzed the maximum peak brightness. What is the game right now trying to output? And compared to the PlayStation 5, there's a big difference because the maximum peak brightness on the Xbox Series was around 800 to 900 or even higher. So you can see there is actually a real HDR information in the game. Very interesting is also that every Auto HDR supported game is relying on the HDR system level calibration on the console or the PC. So make sure you set up this menu on the console or the PC in the correct way. Otherwise, you will have a wrong HDR peak brightness in Auto HDR or in any HDR supported game. And when we're now moving on and we're talking about the real brightness, what I was able to measure on the screen with my colorimeter, then in HDHE I was able to measure around 980 candela compared to the PlayStation 5 with just 250 candela. That's a big difference. Dynamic tone mapping on the Xbox Series was measured with around 950 candela compared to the PlayStation 5 with around 800 candela. You can see still a difference, not as big anymore, but still a difference. And the problem is here, or it's not a problem, but I'm not a big fan of dynamic tone mapping on because dynamic tone mapping on is analyzing the screen all the time and changing the brightness according to the picture information on the screen. So that's why I'm not a big fan. That's why I like HDHE. But HDHE in this case is just usable on the Xbox Series in combination with Auto HDR. But even more important than pure brightness is the question, is there any difference in terms of details in specular highlights between Auto HDR and HDR always on? And yes, it is very easy to answer. There's a big difference because we learned now that the Auto HDR functionality on the Xbox or PC is actually outputting real HDR information. On the PlayStation 5, on the other hand, we still have just SDR information. So that means a big difference in terms of information. And what you can see here right now is the proof that we have much more information on the Xbox Series thanks to Auto HDR support compared to the PlayStation 5 with just SDR information in the content. There's a huge difference in terms of specular highlights and details. Okay, my friends, so what is my conclusion now in terms of Auto HDR on the Xbox Series and PC, of course, versus HDR always on the PlayStation 5? And I think it is very clear after I showed you a couple of recordings and analyses that Auto HDR on the Xbox Series and PC is far more advanced than the HDR always on functionality on the PlayStation 5. But to be very honest, that's not a big surprise because after we watched my video, after I analyzed the game, I found out very quickly that there is no HDR information in non-HDR games on the PlayStation 5. Complete different on the Xbox Series. But downside is here, a game must support this feature. Otherwise, you don't have any HDR at all because the Xbox Series is not capable of outputting HDR in non-HDR games. So that means you end up with SDR, which is, by the way, not a big deal because SDR on a TV like the LG CX is still great. But HDR is even better in my opinion. And this game actually shows it really good. I'm doing more testing in terms of Auto HDR versus non HDR games, and yeah, you will see it here on the channel. Thank you very much for watching me. I hope you like this content, so make sure you like, share and subscribe. Thank you, and I'll see you next time. Bye.